Look, residential construction is expected to fall by about 3% in 2016 calendar year to probably just under 200,000 dwelling commencements. The interesting thing in 2016 is that New South Wales is probably the only state that's going to get some growth. So we'd expect maybe about 3% growth in New South Wales, which is obviously a big market, and that's going to offset some reasonably significant declines in some of the other major states like Victoria, Western Australia and some of the smaller territories. So it's quite a mixed outlook, but clearly New South Wales is the standout. And I suppose fundamentally we're seeing a fairly substantial decline coming through in apartment construction, particularly high density, high rise apartment construction rather than medium density in 2016. We think signs of oversupply will start to develop at some point towards the middle of 2016, and it'll only get worse in terms of its impact on construction. But look, if investors stay in the market for a bit longer buying off the plan, the downturn might take longer to come through, and it might be a more modest correction in 2016 and then a bigger correction in 2017. At some point in 2016, we'd come to the view that just about all markets across Australia, with the exception of New South Wales, or in particular Sydney and some of the regional areas, will move into oversupply. So Sydney will be, by the end of 2016, Sydney will be the only market that still is undersupplied, and can I say, in the case of Sydney, significantly undersupplied. So even with a massive level of high-rise apartment construction at the moment, that market is not going to result in any excess supply developing in the next 3 years. It's going to take 4 or 5 years at least, I suspect, if there's any risk of that market going into oversupply. But elsewhere around Australia, even markets like Brisbane, which people are fairly bullish on at the moment, we think apartment construction in the inner areas is going over the top, and at some point by the end of 2016 there'll be some excess supply there. Detached housing, not so. Detached housing might still recover in calendar 16, but apartment construction by the latter part of 16 and certainly going into 17 will be falling sharply in Queensland, and of course WA is moving into substantial oversupply with a dramatic drop-off in the level of net overseas migration and overall population growth in Perth and WA overall. I suppose the key point there, and I've touched on this with the earlier question, if there's some upside to our forecasts, it will be because foreign buyers stay in the market and continue to buy off the plan in big numbers, not just the next 6 months, which I think in many markets is probably still fairly guaranteed that that'll happen. I don't think investor demand is going to come off that quickly, either overseas or local investors. But I think by the second half of the year we would be expecting that certainly local investor demand will have started to fall off significantly in the markets where there's real significant concern about excess supply developing, particularly in inner city apartments in Brisbane and Melbourne, and also I suppose even markets like Perth where vacancy rates are up around 4.5% or more at the moment. So I think local investors certainly out of the market, overseas investors, I think that's probably where there's some upside potential, and the market could perform a little bit stronger if developers continue to sell off the plan at high rates and get maybe a higher proportion of offshore investors taking up product than construction, even in markets headed to oversupply. We could see stronger activity in 16 than we're predicting and a more modest correction. But my big warning is the more modest correction you get in that high density apartment market in 2016, the risk is 2017 and 18 is going to fall even more rapidly. And we're talking about, if you want to isolate the inner Melbourne, inner Brisbane markets and look at the high density component of those markets, at some point construction's got to fall by 50%, maybe as much as 60%, because we are at incredibly high levels, unsustainable, and ultimately it must lead to significant excess supply.